The June ocean breeze swept through the coastal pines, carrying with it the scent of salt and the ancient hush of crashing waves. From the rooftop of Horizon Bay Resort, one of Oregon's most luxurious seaside properties, Ethan Cole sat alone, a glass of whiskey swirling in his hand. Though the evening temperature had dropped, Ethan didn't feel cold, just as his life had never really felt warm. At 36, Ethan was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made billionaire, founder of a prestigious chain of eco-resorts stretching across the West Coast. He had it all: power, wealth, influence, and acclaim. But behind the crisp white shirt and gleaming Swiss watch was a man so isolated, he couldn't recall the last time he'd felt genuine joy. As a young man, Ethan had dreamed of becoming an architect, not to build monuments of ego, but to design spaces that reconnected people with nature. That dream, however, was soon replaced by ambition and the demands of the market. For over a decade, he had trained himself to view life as a series of transactions. Now he was a master of control and a stranger to emotion. His phone buzzed with a notification. Meeting with the Community Tourism Initiative, conference room, 10th floor, 6:30 in the afternoon. Ethan took another sip of his drink and stood up. Meetings with cultural or environmental groups were usually just a formality, a box to tick in the company's sustainability strategy. But tonight, he had no idea he was about to meet someone who would shake the very foundation of everything he believed in. The 10th floor conference room was sleek and modern, outfitted with reclaimed wood panels, soft amber lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a foggy shoreline. Ethan entered with his usual composed stride, and though he said nothing at first, everyone in the room registered his presence immediately. Not just because of who he was, but because of the quiet authority he always carried. "Good evening," Ethan said, his voice low and measured. "I'm Ethan Cole, CEO of Horizon Group." 4 people stood to greet him. 3 were middle-aged men dressed like environmental consultants, button-down shirts, reading glasses hanging from cords. The 4th, a young woman, remained focused on her laptop until Ethan approached. She looked up, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. No makeup. Soft, natural curls falling over her shoulders. A simple navy blue dress. But her eyes, deep brown, calm, held something that made Ethan pause. No flirtation, no performative smile, just a steady, observant gaze. "Hello," she said, shaking his hand with quiet firmness. "I'm Maya Sullivan, academic coordinator for the Heritage Roots Project." Ethan nodded, holding her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Pleasure to meet you." Her accent carried the softness of the American South, gentle but precise. Ethan noticed it immediately. It lacked the hardened edge of corporate speech he was used to. There was something grounded in it, honest, and entirely unpretentious. The meeting began. Slides appeared, showcasing a plan for immersive cultural experiences, from indigenous cooking classes and traditional crafts to oral storytelling circles. But Ethan found his attention drifting, not to the numbers, but to Maya. He watched how her fingers lightly touched the edge of her laptop when she was thinking, how her lips pursed slightly when considering a tough question, how her eyes lit up when she spoke about the Cherokee communities she worked with. "Sustainable tourism isn't just about reducing emissions," Maya said. "It's about connection, between people and culture, between visitors and those who call the land home." Ethan had never heard anyone speak about tourism like that. "And you would personally oversee these activities?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "Absolutely," she replied. "I have a master's in cultural anthropology and have coordinated similar programs in the Appalachian region." Ethan nodded slowly, saying nothing. He couldn't explain why he was so drawn to her, but he knew it wasn't physical. It was something deeper, a part of himself he thought he'd lost. By the time the meeting ended, the sky outside had faded to dusk. Ethan stood up, moved by something instinctive and unfamiliar. "If you don't have plans tonight," he said, "there's a place nearby that serves amazing cornbread, made the old-fashioned way." Maya blinked, caught slightly off guard. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "Not at all," Ethan offered a rare smile. "If we're going to work together, I'd like to understand more about what brought you to this project." She hesitated. then nodded. In that case, I'd be happy to. Ethan couldn't quite explain what compelled him to speak. Throughout his entire career, he'd met with hundreds of partners, consultants, and investors, all of whom he kept at a professional, even calculated distance. He wasn't in the habit of inviting strangers to dinner, especially not after a brief meeting, but Maya was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. There was something about her that disoriented him, not in a threatening way, but almost relieving. He didn't feel the urge to read her the way he usually dissected people. He wasn't analyzing her like a project. With Maya, all he felt was the urge to listen and to feel. The restaurant sat tucked inside a weathered wooden house on the edge of Whales Bay. Warm golden light spilled through its windows, casting soft streaks across the foggy night air tinged with salt. Ethan opened the door for Maya, a small gesture he hadn't planned. She nodded with a quiet, "Thank you," her curls catching the last breeze as she stepped inside. The interior was rustic and calm. Dark oak wood, hand-stitched tablecloths, wildflowers in glass jars at every corner. A vinyl record played slow jazz from a dusty speaker, quiet enough for conversation, deep enough for reflection. They were seated by a window. Beyond the glass, the waves lapped gently against the rocky shore, steady like a second heartbeat. "Do you often eat at places like this?" Ethan asked as their server poured red wine into their glasses. "Not often," Maya replied, pressing her lips thoughtfully. "But there's something about these unpolished places that feels real." Ethan nodded, watching her through the rim of his glass. There was something about how she sat, unarmored, unposed, simply present, that made him feel like he was shedding something invisible. "Did you always want to work in cultural tourism?" he asked. She shook her head. "Actually, I once wanted to teach history, but when my grandmother passed, I realized a whole world was disappearing, and no one was writing it down." Or she spoke of her grandmother, the last woman in her village who could sing the old Cherokee songs, of winter nights spent by the fire, learning to braid grass into bracelets, of the ache in her chest when she realized if she didn't continue the stories, no one would. Ethan fell quiet. He thought of his own grandmother, the one who taught him about architecture with miniature wooden models, who believed a beautiful home is a place where the soul can rest. He hadn't felt that in years. They ordered wood-fired cornbread, traditional bean stew, and seared salmon, dishes native to Oregon. Maya smiled as Ethan carefully divided the bread into perfect slices, as if it were a five-star entree. "Are you always this precise? Only when something makes me want to slow down?" The answer surprised her, not because of what he said, but how he said it. His voice had softened, like river water slipping under a sheet of smooth stone. Their conversation continued, effortless and open. They spoke of places, memories, and meaning. Not once did they mention contracts, budgets, or business opportunities. When dinner ended, Maya rested her elbow on the table and gazed out the window. "The last time I sat like this with someone, it must have been 5 years ago." Ethan didn't ask why. He simply replied gently, "I can't remember the last time I did." They both laughed, a quiet, honest laugh. Not polite, not forced. It felt like stillness in a world that rarely paused. And in that moment, Ethan knew his life had just started to shift. 3 days after the dinner, Ethan sent Maya a short email. "I'll be heading to Klamath Falls to survey a property near Modoc Point. Want to join? Not for work. Just curious to hear you talk more." No auto signature, no company logo, no subject line, just an invitation. Simple, human. Maya replied in under 10 minutes. "If you're driving, I'll bring cornbread." And so they went. The 3-hour drive from Whales Bay to Klamath took them through pine forests, sleepy towns, and winding riverside highways. Ethan, who was used to private helicopters and tight agendas, found time slowing like an old record. Maya, in the passenger seat, brought a book but barely opened it. She was too caught up in the scenery, and every so often she'd glance at him and smile, saying nothing. When they arrived at Modoc Point, a sacred site for the Klamath people, Ethan watched surprised as Maya slipped off her shoes. She walked barefoot across the damp grass, her fingers brushing the bark of an ancient tree as if whispering something. He didn't interrupt, just watched. "My grandma used to say there are places that heal you just by standing still in them," Maya said, turning back toward him, and I believed her. Ethan nodded. He didn't say it aloud, but something in him had indeed shifted. They walked the shoreline, then sat by a wide, flat rock. Maya spoke of her project in Appalachia, of elders telling stories in a language nearly extinct. She spoke with her eyes, her hands, her memory, and Ethan, for the first time in years, didn't try to lead the conversation. He just listened and felt small, but free. Between stories, Maya looked at him quietly and said, "You're the first person who's made me feel like I don't have to prove anything." Ethan turned toward her, saying nothing. Their eyes met, not with demand, not with promise, just something true and steady as a heartbeat. Maya looked down, touching the woven grass bracelet on her wrist, something she'd worn since childhood. "I always thought I'd only give myself to someone who made me feel safe and truly seen." Ethan was silent. No surprise, no reaction, just a slow nod, like acknowledging a gift too precious to unwrap right away. "And you?" Maya asked, barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled, half sad, half real. "I used to think all I needed was to win. That trust, connection, love were extras. But today I'm not so sure anymore." As Maya spoke of her grandmother, her voice steady, yet eyes heavy with something unnamed, Ethan felt a knot rise in his throat. It wasn't sorrow, it wasn't tragedy. It was a quiet grief, accepted like a stone, that had lived long enough in one's pocket to feel familiar. He had seen dozens of women cry over things he never quite understood. Emotions had always been a foreign language to him. But in that moment, when Maya lowered her gaze and gently touched the grass-woven bracelet on her wrist, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. He didn't want to have her. He didn't want to conquer, possess, or claim. He just wanted her to not be hurt. He wanted the world to be kind to her, in the same way she was kind to vanishing stories and fading voices. It was a kind of affection Ethan had never known, one that wasn't fueled by desire or control, but by the simple longing to be near, quietly. If she needed someone to sit in silence with, he would. If she needed a safe pause in a noisy world, he would be that pause. And that was when Ethan realized, love doesn't always begin with passion. Sometimes it begins with profound respect for what the other person carries. Memories, wounds, sacred things, too delicate to name. The day after returning to Whales Bay, Ethan had just entered his main office at the resort when his assistant Julia approached with a tight expression. "You should hear this from me first before it hits the whispers," she said, lowering her voice. "Charlotte Hayes is in the lobby." Ethan froze. Charlotte. The name brought with it an entire chapter he had tried to bury. The woman who was once his fiancée, his partner in every glossy magazine cover, the ideal match in Ethan's former world, until he realized it was all a performance, a trade for power and visibility. "What does she want?" he asked, his voice cold. "She says she wants to talk," Julia replied. "And she's not alone." Less than 2 minutes later, the familiar echo of high heels clicked down the hallway. Charlotte appeared, still stunning, her blonde curls soft and styled, a designer coat cinched at the waist, as if not a day had passed since her last photo op. "Ethan," she smiled, perfectly composed. "It's been a while." Ethan didn't offer her a seat. "Charlotte, what are you doing here?" "Rumors spread fast," she said, stepping in without invitation. "You've been seen with a woman. Maya, right?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That's none of your business?" Charlotte tilted her head slightly, as if she'd expected that. "The problem, Ethan, is that you're stepping into something bigger than you realize. And Maya, she doesn't belong in your world." Before Ethan could respond, a man stepped in behind her. It was Senator James Rowland, a face Ethan knew from several fundraising galas. "Ethan," Rowland nodded casually. "Hope we're not interrupting. We need a word." Ethan stiffened. No doubt now, this wasn't a social visit. It was a move. They stepped into a private meeting room. Charlotte kept her cold smile. Rowland placed a thick folder on the table. We've reviewed the cultural tourism plan that Maya Sullivan is coordinating, Roland began. There are inconsistencies, funding channels, affiliate contracts, and a few questionable connections. Is that a threat? Ethan asked quietly. No, Ethan, Roland replied with a mild grin. It's a chance. Cut ties with her. She's not just a risk to your image, she's a crack in your armor. Ethan looked him straight in the eye, and in that moment, he saw the version of himself from years ago. Cold, calculated, willing to trade truth for control. He stood up, calm but firm. I think we're done here. Charlotte gave a short laugh. You'll regret this. Maybe, Ethan said, but at least this time, I know what I'm fighting for. News spread quickly within elite circles that Ethan Cole had rejected a major political partnership. The next day, online gossip sites leaked photos of Ethan and Maya at Modoc Point, laced with suggestive commentary about a questionable private connection between a business mogul and a nonprofit director. Maya saw the article first thing that morning. She sat in silence at the kitchen counter of her small apartment, fingers wrapped tightly around a coffee mug. Ethan arrived shortly after. I'm okay, Maya said before he could speak, but I need to know. This won't stop here, will it? No, Ethan replied, but if you're with me, we face it together. Maya looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Then I won't back down. The next morning, Ethan and Maya appeared together at Horizon's internal press briefing, originally planned to unveil a new sustainability strategy, now turned into a stage for public scrutiny. All eyes turned to Maya, some skeptical, some cautious. But she walked straight ahead, chin lifted, unwavering. When asked about the ambiguity in her relationship with Ethan, Maya didn't flinch. I'm here as a cultural advocate, not a symbol, and I don't need permission to love someone, especially when that person shares the values I fight for. The room went quiet, no defiance in her voice, just truth. Ethan stood beside her, not interrupting, not shielding. When it was his turn to speak, he said only this. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to realize what's truly worth keeping. I don't want to wait that long anymore. That night, Ethan made a direct call to Senator Roland. We're not on the same side, he said, voice firm. I won't trade silence for status. If I have to, I'll bring everything into the light. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel fear in losing power. He felt relief, as if he had finally let go of a weight he didn't even know he was carrying. No threats, no bargaining. Just a man choosing for the first time to stand where it's right, no matter what it might cost him. On the drive back from the press conference, Maya said nothing. The ocean wind howled against the windows, but inside the car, the silence was heavy, not uncomfortable, just full. Ethan kept his eyes on the coastal road, but his thoughts churned. Everything had spun out of control. The articles, the criticisms, and especially Maya's gaze. He didn't know what she was thinking. He didn't know if she still wanted to walk this road with him. When they pulled up to the small wooden house Maya had rented at the edge of Whales Bay, she opened the door and stepped out without looking back. But Ethan couldn't just drive away. He turned off the engine and followed her inside. The house was quiet. They sat across from each other in the simple kitchen, yellow light spilling onto the old wooden table. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke. His voice not firm like usual, but husky, as if each word had to be swallowed and tested before being said aloud. I didn't know all of this would drag you into so much trouble. Maya looked up, not with anger or blame, just a steady, honest gaze. I'm not a victim, Ethan. I chose this. Just like you did. Ethan paused. Then he looked at her, not as a man used to control, but as someone ready to lay down his last armor. I want you to stay, he said gently, not just as a partner, as someone who walks this path with me, if you're willing. Maya didn't answer right away. She stood, walked out to the porch where the dark pine trees rustled in the wind, whispering like old spirits. Ethan followed but kept a respectful distance. After a while, Maya finally said, I need to go home, to Tennessee. I need to see where I began and ask myself some questions. Ethan didn't hesitate. I'll go with you. A week later, they arrived in a small Appalachian town where Maya's parents lived in a rustic wooden house her father, Thomas, had built with his own hands 3 decades ago. He was a quiet man with stern eyes that weren't cold. When he saw Ethan step inside, he didn't ask who he was. He just looked at him for a long time, as if reading an old page he wasn't sure he could trust. At dinner that first night, Maya spoke openly to her parents about the project, the chaos, and about Ethan, with no embellishment, no filter. When she finished, Thomas set down his spoon and turned to Ethan. "You know you're walking into a world that won't go easy on you, right?" Ethan nodded. "I know." "Ever failed before?" Thomas asked, still watching closely. Ethan paused a second. "Yes, but never because I told the truth." There was silence. Then for the first time that evening, Thomas gave a faint smile, just enough for Maya to let out a quiet breath. It was the first sign of acceptance. Though Thomas wasn't one for many words during their stay in Tennessee, Ethan began to feel a quiet acceptance. It didn't come through praise or hearty handshakes, but through small gestures. When Thomas handed Ethan an old pair of gardening gloves, when he invited him to walk the maple grove behind the house, or when he silently set aside a piece of grilled meat for him at Sunday dinner. Ethan didn't try to impress. He just showed up, present, patient, and real. For the first time, he understood that trust isn't something you win with words, but something you earn by simply staying. Maya's mother, Helen, was more reserved, but in the gentle way she looked at her daughter, and in the small nods she offered Ethan each morning over coffee, Maya knew her mother was beginning to open the door. On their final night at the house, Ethan took Maya's hand beneath the front porch light. "If I said, 'I want to be with you long term,' what would you say?" Maya met his gaze, calm and clear. The wind passed softly under the eaves, carrying the scent of dried grass and quiet woods. "I'd say, 'I believe you,'" she whispered, "but I want to go slowly. I'm not ready for an engagement." Ethan nodded, no trace of disappointment. "I don't need a promise. Just knowing you're here with me fully is enough." Maya smiled and leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "Then starting tonight, I'm yours, officially." Just a few days after Ethan and Maya returned from Tennessee, while the cultural center's roof was still waiting to be finished, the real storm arrived. That morning, as Ethan stepped into the resort's main lobby, he saw government vehicles lined up outside, agents in dark suits with federal IDs checking paperwork, flipping through documents. While outside, a local TV crew had already set up cameras, reporters surrounding the entrance as if they had been tipped off in advance. Julia ran up to him, holding an iPad, her face pale. She didn't say a word too many, just turned the screen toward Ethan and let him read. Horizon suspected of money laundering through community projects. Sources claim the company used a native cultural initiative to mask questionable financial activity. Beneath the headline was a photo of Maya speaking at a community gathering, with quotes from an old environmental panel she once joined, now chopped and twisted into a politically sensitive context. Ethan said nothing, but it felt like his chest had dropped into a freezing void. They weren't just investigating the company. They were targeting Maya. They were turning someone who preserved memory into someone under suspicion, and they were doing it right in front of the very community she was trying to protect. That afternoon, the resort was officially under investigation by 3 federal agencies: the IRS, the Department of Justice, and the Anti-Money Laundering Commission. They requested 5 years of financial records, combed through every grant, donation, and project invoice, and focused especially on the Modak Point Cultural Center. Major news outlets picked up the story, escalating the narrative from suspicion to full-blown accusations. Bribery of consultants, hinting that Maya had been paid to politicize what was supposedly a cultural project. Public opinion fractured. Horizon's board put pressure on Ethan to temporarily withdraw from nonprofit work to protect investor confidence. He refused, without hesitation. As rumors spread, Maya made the decision to speak, without waiting for permission. She chose to stand in the middle of the unfinished community center, amid sawdust and hammering and walls still open to the wind. No microphones, no press statement, just her own voice. "My name is Maya Sullivan. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and if helping this community preserve their language, their legends, and their memory is being labeled as money laundering, then maybe it's time we reevaluate what justice even means." No one clapped at first, but an elderly woman walked up, took her hand with trembling fingers, and spoke in the ancient Modic tongue. Maya nodded, eyes wet. Ethan stood in the back, silent. He knew. She didn't need him to speak for her. She needed him to stay. The investigation lasted 10 days. Every morning, Ethan met with lawyers, signed paperwork, reviewed statements. Maya continued her work at the center as if nothing had happened, teaching native children to write Modic letters, recording oral stories from the elders. Media coverage continued, but slowly the local community began to speak up for her. People posted old photos, shared stories, wrote blog posts. The narrative began to shift, not through PR but through people. Finally, the results of the investigation were released. No evidence of money laundering, no signs of bribery, no grounds for prosecution. The story made it to the news in a few short lines. Federal audit concludes, no charges filed. No apology, no correction. But Ethan and Maya knew what mattered most had been protected, the truth. That night, as Ethan stood on Maya's porch looking out toward the dark woods, the pieces he used to hold dear, status, company, reputation, suddenly felt small. Maya came to his side without a word. He turned to her and, for the first time, said out loud what he'd only dared to think until now. I don't just want to prove we're innocent. I want to prove that justice, if it still exists, must begin with the smallest things. She didn't say anything. She just nodded and held his hand tightly. Everything felt like it was starting over, but in a completely different way. There were no more investigations, no more emergency meetings or sensational headlines. Ethan and Maya spent their days quietly at Modic Point, finishing the last bricks of the community center, without seeking attention, without needing praise. One afternoon, as they sat in the main hall now filled with golden sunlight, the same space that had once been an open wooden frame, now transformed into a classroom for native children. Maya pulled out a handwritten proposal she had drafted earlier. I have an idea, she said. Not just another small project, but a system where every indigenous culture has the chance to tell its own story in its own voice. She called it Heritage Roots Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on preserving indigenous culture through educational tourism, a place where visitors wouldn't just come to look, but to learn, to listen, and to truly understand. Each destination would be an open classroom, guided not by textbooks, but by the communities themselves. Ethan read through each line, sitting in silence for a long moment. Then he said, we'll do it, not to generate profit, but to generate memory. And this time, we're not just building a place, we're building a value system. He invested everything, not through his corporation, not for shares or rights. It came from one place only, his heart. They started sending invitations to UNESCO experts, to anthropology departments at universities, to tribal leaders, artisans, and language teachers who had been quietly keeping their cultures alive. And the miracle was, they came, not for fame, but for sincerity. A month later, at the official launch of the foundation in Ashland, Oregon, Ethan stood beside Maya in silence. He didn't give a speech, didn't step in front of the cameras. He just watched her, with eyes that seemed to be memorizing every moment. That night, in the small garden behind the house, beneath strands of warm yellow lights and soft music playing from the center, Ethan took her hand. No grand gestures, no audience, just the two of them, and one simple question. Would you walk with me, not just in this mission, but for the rest of our lives? Maya looked at him for a long time, and this time, she didn't search for reasons to delay, because she had already seen this man standing before her was no longer a cold investor, no longer driven by profit or power. He was the man who chose to stay when others walked away, the man who had learned how to listen with his whole heart. Yes, she said, her voice soft but certain. I do. And then, as if the universe had quietly nodded in agreement, a new day began. Not with grand fanfare or bright headlines, but with soft light filtering through the trees and the whisper of ocean breeze. Just enough to remind them that what truly matters is still unfolding. The next morning, the ocean was calm like a giant mirror stretching all the way to the horizon. A soft breeze drifted across the balcony, carrying the salty scent of waves and the rising steam of freshly brewed coffee. Ethan and Maya sat side by side on an old wooden bench, hands wrapped around porcelain mugs, eyes resting on the distance. No words needed, because silence now spoke more than enough. They were no longer the same two people from months ago. No more boardrooms, no more reports or campaigns, no more tense meetings or suspicious stares. Surrounded by the wide-open sea and the soft sounds of morning birds, there were only two souls, finally at peace, with themselves and with each other. Maya opened a plan on her iPad, this time not to seek funding, but to build a vision together with Ethan. "I've been thinking," she said, "if this model truly works here in Modoc Point, there's no reason we can't take it to other tribal nations, from Alaska to New Mexico." She looked at him, eyes bright, not with ambition, but with belief. Ethan nodded, no explanation needed. In his mind, he already saw a map of faraway lands, untold stories, forgotten communities now being given the chance to speak in their own words. But what moved him most wasn't the scale or potential. It was the fact that, for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged to something he didn't have to own. He no longer saw himself as the one in charge of a project. He was a companion, a learner, someone walking slowly beside a woman he didn't just love, but deeply respected. "You know," Ethan said, his voice quieter, "I used to think I was missing power, but it turns out what I really needed was a life that meant something, and a love that's real." Maya didn't respond. She simply reached out and held his hand tightly. Together, their eyes followed the path that led down to the center, where a brand new sign had just been installed, its fresh wood still scented by the morning breeze. The sign bore a line etched in bronze, "Heritage Roots HQ, where culture breathes." Beneath the morning light, the two of them stood in front of that sign, not loudly, not for anyone to see, just quietly holding hands, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud, that this journey wouldn't end here, that after all they had faced, this was only the beginning, and somewhere beyond the waves, the future waited, not with certainty, but with possibility, and that was enough.